Welcome to the Subjective Professor podcast, where we reject coercion and hypocrisy. It's Wednesday, August 12th, 2026, episode 571. We're going to talk about toxic masculinity. Yeah, I was looking at something this morning. I tried to find what it was exactly that I was looking at, but it passed. My feed refreshed, and so I don't know what I saw. But I keyed in on this concept of toxic masculinity, and I thought I would make an episode about it. Where I wish I could insert, uh, the reference what I saw to put it in some kind of context. But yeah, I just couldn't find that post that I originally saw. So anyway. So toxic masculinity is a topic that's been around for a while, and it was just so obviously superficial that I never really bothered to make a comment about it. But something I saw just kind of clicked and said, "Hey, why don't you just make an episode about that?" So I might be late to the party. You may have already worked everything out, but here it is for the record, just in case. But this whole concept of toxic masculinity is an example of narrow subjectivity, which I had raised with my other race-related episodes. But as you know, the way that I define race to talk about maleness or masculinity is the creation of a category, a generalization. But this one is a little bit different because there are several characteristics that are associated with toxic masculinity. So it becomes far easier to undermine and expose as just simply being narrow subjectivity. Now, I'll cut to the conclusion, which is that this exercise in narrow subjectivity, training people to look at the world through a very, very narrow lens, is for the purpose of creating regulation and legislation for control. And this is also an example of what passes as scholarship today and why censorship is vital for people in the university and in society, bureaucrats especially, because they don't want you to see all of the other subjectivities. They don't want you to be able to see and know that other perspectives exist. And this was a common phenomena that I encountered in the university, which led me to describe that mental box, the box that we have to try to get out of to find those better ideas, those other perspectives that will lead to solutions and improve and benefit society. All right, so Wikipedia defines toxic masculinity as a concept used in academic and media discussions to refer to those aspects of hegemonic masculinity that are socially destructive, such as misogyny, homophobia, and violent domination. These traits are considered toxic due in part to their promotion of violence, including sexual assault and domestic violence. Socialization of boys sometimes also normalizes violence, such as in the saying, boys will be boys, about bullying and aggression. So that was the basic intro definition of what toxic masculinity is. And I think it's sufficient just to use this definition uh, and go through it line by line to expose why it is essentially superficial. Now, an argument that I've made in the past is that a scholarship, people who are in grad school, graduate students, and graduate level professors will make up a lot of terminology to hide what in fact they're actually doing. So if we strip away all the 50-cent vocab words that they create to create confusion, to make it seem like they're being profound and deep, but in reality, it's just all another name for something extremely superficial. And I find myself always going to the dictionary because they're constantly coming up with new terms, and they have to keep the game going, to keep people confused as to what's really going on. All right, so line by line, let's go through it. We'll also look at the definitions of some of the terms that they're using. So the first line reads, toxic masculinity is a concept used in academic and media discussions to refer to those aspects of hegemonic masculinity that are socially destructive, such as misogyny, homophobia, and violent domination. All right, so toxic is something really bad, harmful, and if you get exposed to it, then you will suffer for it. Hegemonic domination, hegemony. This is a word that's come up a lot, especially in the Gulf War, Gulf War II, III, the war against Iran. And they talk about American hegemony in the region. Whew, hegemony. And it's spelled Hegemonic, hegemonic, and hegemony, Hegemony, hegemony. It's just basically being on top, being in power, calling the shots. And there's no dialogue. It's all one way kind of relationship and situation. So America is the dominant. Everyone has to do whatever it is America says. And in this situation, in this context, now we're talking about male traits. So men being on top, men being leaders, men being CEOs, men being presidents, blah, blah, blah. So men being dominant, in control, and women are subservient. Then this socially destructive behavior, right? So behaviors that are hegemonic masculinity that are socially destructive. Well, socially destructive basically means it's bad for society. It's not a positive. It's not productive. It doesn't improve society, such as misogyny, homophobia, and violent domination. And here, when they list these three things, notice that the first two are mostly attitudes that don't necessarily translate into criminal behavior, like assault or rape, something like that. So misogyny and homophobia is lumped in with violent domination, which is, I believe, an actual crime. So violent domination would mean rape, assault, uh, you know, uh, you know, murder, okay, these things. And there's a big difference between mental attitudes and actual physical violence. There might be potential, but it does not guarantee, nor does it mean that one will necessarily follow the other. So in this really neat trick that people, so-called academics that do this kind of thing, they conflate it. They put together two different things in the same list to make it seem like they're all the same. So to be misogynistic or homophobic does not necessarily mean that you're going to turn to violence and crime. And so they're mixing attitudes with actual crime. And I know that a lot of people are pushing this idea that thinking it is the same as doing it, but no, this is not a Minority Report thought crime kind of situation yet. Uh, in other words, one can be homophobic without being criminal. Like if you don't like homosexuals, then it doesn't mean that you're going to do violence against them. You might be misogynistic. You might think that women don't belong in the workplace, but it doesn't mean you're going to go around and assaulting women. That just doesn't work. Uh, but violence is actual violence. And uh, why you engage in the violent act, the criminal act, well, there could be lots of different reasons, not necessarily homophobia or misogyny. Now, what this does is it sets up the phenomena that we commonly see today, that anything perceived as anti-woman is misogynistic. Right? So it's an actual crime which created injury. This is why we see today it's just so common to say something like I don't support the war against Iran, and people will say, "Oh, well, then you're anti-Semitic because you won't support Israel." This kind of goofy, jumping to a conclusion non sequitur, like things that don't follow each other, logically follow each other, is all over the place. We see this, and it's this sort of sloppy scholarship that you see at this base level, on the level of the definition, which then plays out in society uh, in different ways, and that would be one example, right? So if you say, "Oh, I don't like that person," and then you say, "Oh, well, then you must be anti-Semitic, you must be a racist, you must be this or that," and it's that lumping together of ideas. Like there's no room for subtlety or nuance, and that's what a mob does. It's the mob psychology. I don't care about the details. I was given my instructions, and you know what? I just feel like doing it too. The next line in this definition reads, these traits are considered toxic due in part to their promotion of violence, including sexual assault and domestic violence. Well, now this is a direct causal relationship, right? That if you exhibit these traits, then you will engage in violence. But many don't exhibit criminal traits, right? They don't fall into commit crimes of sexual assault. In other words, just because you are misogynistic does not necessarily mean that you will engage in violence. I said this before, but to sort of emphasize it and to introduce other traits, like what other traits need to exist in a person that will then go to violence? What is missing, or what must be there in addition to being misogynistic, for example, that will lead to actual violence? And then what about other violence that is in society? What causes all of that? So I'm not saying that it's not possible um, that someone who is misogynistic will engage in violence, but to identify subjective value judgments on behavior and attitudes you don't like is not academic. Uh, in other words, I don't like the fact that you are misogynistic, and so therefore I'm going to criminalize it. I don't like the fact that you don't like homosexuals, and so I'm going to criminalize it. This criminalization of attitudes and behaviors is not the way to go. And I've talked about this before, that regulation of attitudes like this will result in the opposite. You'll have even more of it. And also, you won't have solved the problem. You'll just have made it worse. So, on a superficial level, this is subjective at best. Um, and really, what we should be focused on is the crime. In other words, we're just talking about crime, like rape. Um, that's a crime. But when we start talking about traits of people we don't like, then we're having a problem. And you can see the relationship with race, right? That if you make certain associations with certain people's skin color, then does that mean that everyone is that way? There are no other contributing factors other than skin color. And then if we look at all of the other so-called color-based race categories, that there is no crime there at all. So it's just kind of very sloppy. You have to keep it superficial to make it work kind of approach that most people seem to enjoy today, at least in the university. If, though, we had a justice system and we had justice in society that focused on actual rights and not just cultural preferences, then we might be able to get to the heart of things. In other words, I think our justice system is so screwed up that the injustice itself is what leads to a lot of violence and a lot of increased hatred and negative attitudes in society, because it's an unjust system. It's hypocritical. And, people who want justice and I think that is a very sort of very characteristic of human beings, the desire for justice. And when we are living in injustice, then anger, hatred at who we think is the cause of this injustice, that increases. But you've already laid the groundwork by so polluting the educational system that people will go to the violence and the crime far quicker, more readily than if we had a good educational system and a proper justice system. When we examine you know, ideas like misogyny and homophobia, when you get right down to it, when there is no violence, when there is no actual crime associated, but just simply an expression of preference, then it's like a religion. Now we're talking about how uh, certain beliefs should be codified or deemed as heretical if you go against what is the established religion or what you're supposed to believe. Now, if property rights are protected, like you can't assault me because you don't like me thing, right? If that is enforced, if it's properly punished, then everything else is subject to negotiation and law, right? So let's just say a customer walks into my store and the person is I'm a misogynist, and a woman walks into the store and I said, well, you can't shop here because you're a woman. Well, society is going to punish you, right? Because word will get out that you hate women, you don't want to have women shop there, and so no one will shop there. Otherwise, if you're a man and you go shopping there, people will call you a misogynist as well. So you stay away as well. And so, these cultural preferences remain mute, and you don't speak it because you know you're going to suffer as a result. And that is the sort of natural protection of our basic rights. And if you really push it, well, then now you just have to figure out how to negotiate that within yourself or with others. But it's no one else's business, really. Um, People make the choices as they want. And I've talked about this before, but when you call it institutional racism, and so you need to write a law that says, no, no, you have to serve women. You're a misogynist, but you have to serve women. Well, that's not going to change my mind. I'm still going to hate women, but now I'm protected. I'm protected by the law. As long as I allow women to shop at my store, I can still be a misogynist. So there's no real effect on the individual, which is what we want, right? And the way that you affect the person so that they will, be less of a misogynist is by letting people choose in freedom. So they don't like that store. They don't like the fact that the owner is a misogynist, and so they'll shop somewhere else, which will either mean that the misogynist business owner, grocery store owner, will face bankruptcy or soften his views on women. The next thing about the problem with this approach on toxic masculinity is that some women prefer that kind of man, right? People who exhibit the so-called toxic masculinity traits. So are these women a problem too? I'm sure that within the toxic masculinity genre, that these people are have been socialized to like that kind of man. Or let's just not talk about it. Let's just focus on the men that we want to get rid of. So it's goofy, right? Once you start digging down a little bit, then there's more, there's other things that we need to consider. And keep in mind, I'm trying to keep a time limit, so I'm not going too deep into this. There's an attitude that boys don't cry. Well, yeah, they do, because crying men is not masculine. And so they sort of shame males, boys. It's weird using that language, male or boys, given the whole trans thing. But anyway, uh, but yeah, men cry a lot. And it's more about when they cry and around whom. It seems to me that this whole boys don't cry kind of thing is, this sort of twisted, uh, toxic masculinity creator attitude where they don't see men crying over the same things that women do. And when women don't really feel all that emotional, men are just, you know, crying their eyes out, you know. So it's this kind of, oh, okay, so you don't like when I cry and the things that I cry about, but it's not that men don't ever cry. That's just kind of goofy. And then when you go into other cultures, men cry so easily and so much. Just watch any K-drama and you'll see that men are crying all the time, right? And because they're just more transparent about that. But I believe that in the West, it's very similar. You just, you know, it's not that cry worthy. So you're going to cry over certain other things. And there are a lot of women who don't like it when men cry too much, right? So that's something else to consider. Uh, and then what about discipline? What about the way that these men or boys were raised? Teaching boys about respect and hard work, responsibility, manners. You know, otherwise you're going to raise bullies. And I was bullied a lot when I was younger, being Asian, when Asians weren't really that many in society yet in America. And I've seen lots of bullying as well. And raising four boys myself, I know that there's a lot of bullying now as well. But you know, I noticed something that as soon as the bullying begins, most times I found, if you just have a talk with the so-called bully, then you realize that that person just crossed the line, that they were just trying to have fun, but because they got a good reaction, they kept doing it. And it was always against the same person. And so it turns, you know, it turns into something else after a while. Habitual teasing turns into bullying. And so what I always try to do is this first sign I see it, I pull that person aside and try to get them to see what it would be like if someone was picking on them. And it usually, 9 times out of 10, it resolves that problem. That 10th person, however, there's something else going on. And that would be another discussion. But most of this kind of uh, negative, so-called toxic behavior, I think could be nipped in the bud. And with proper, you know, parenting or guidance, that most people will steer clear of negative behavior such as that. So, you know, and so you can kind of see where participation trophies come in as well. You know, anyone who's taught little kids and you try to teach a competitive game, losers always cry, especially when it's the first time they're playing a game. So it's all fun and everything, you know, they're having fun and then they lose. They always cry. It's almost rare not to see a kid cry because they're losing. And yeah, that's sort of that happens a lot. But what I like to do is I try to get people to understand what those feelings are, right? Not to say, well, everyone wins, but just to, because you don't want to take anything away from people who win. But what you try to do is you try to either choose a different game, right? Where everyone always has fun, where it's not so much the concept of losers, but some people who win. All right, so ultimately, we're talking about preferences, right? When we're looking at toxic male behavior, we're talking about preferences. Some people don't like something that they see. And when you take away all of that subjectivity, really what you're, you know, the brass tacks of it is crime and punishment. It's sort of like race theory. People don't like certain traits of a person and you know, inscribe uh, exclusive identity as if no one else has that trait. In other words, like if you'll say, oh, all Asians are criminals, for example. Well, then, you know, just because you saw a couple of Asians committing a crime, now you're now going to say all Asians are criminals, right? Commit that crime. In other words, no one else right? Someone who's white or black or brown or red, they're not going to commit that crime, which is almost ludicrous on its face. So there have to be other characteristics, other traits, something else going on in that life, not just the fact that they are Asian or yellow or male, that they're going to do certain things. Uh, has a crime been committed, or you just simply don't like what you see? And so that's that race theory element. Oh, I see you and I see crime. I see you and I think you're up to no good, right? Or has a crime been committed? So are we talking about preferences here? People who don't like certain male traits for whatever reason. Now, the actual goal is regulation, rules to control and give some people more authority, not for a better world. I mean, they say they want a better world, but when you look at the results, it's clearly not better. And so they have to pretend that it's better. Um, Now, if you do engage in this kind of behavior, make observations, and then pass all these regulations and criminalize certain behaviors, you will get pushback. And the pushback is hyper masculinity. Um, but at this point, when you have this toxic masculinity, hyper masculinity, now you get caricatures. You get these distorted representations of masculinity, which I think neither are really representative of what it means to be a man. In other words, less freedom in society because of increased regulation results in negative outcomes. You don't get positive consequences. You get a lot of negative ones. Hyper masculinity. I mean, come on, what is hyper masculinity? You could say, oh, that's a man's man, but I'm pretty sure that uh, those aren't the only ones who are making it through life in happiness and peace. Uh, and that's the weird thing. You now are focusing on caricatures, not just actual living. Now, I'm not saying that there are no problems. There are problems in society, yes, for sure. But this is not the way that we resolve that. In other words, we need a justice system to get to the bottom of the issues. Was there really a crime that was committed here? Or are you just upset that a person you don't like won the competition, or a person you don't like is somehow got the job, right? Are we just talking about preferences here, or are we talking about injustice, actual injustice, physical violence? Are we also just going to say that superficial judgments, superficial arguments are make certain behaviors and legislation justified? That's a hard sell, right? So, are you saying that rushing to judgment, being quick to judge, is a good thing? There are a lot of other things that we could say at this point. So at the root of it all is the education bubble, federal funding and loans, which led to the expansion of the university. And then a lot of university scholars then highlighting the worst of ideas because it was gaining traction. You got simplistic thinking, reductionistic, and intolerant thinking, and this fosters more violence. Regulations empower proponents of these superficial concepts to be violent to perceived offenders, which leads to even more censorship. And this whole phenomena ignores actual crime, like illegal immigrants and rape gangs in Europe. So because of one racialization that you've done, one piece of legislation that you're trying to push these days, you're going to ignore everything else, right? And so this kind of ignorance, this kind of ignoring everything else has led to a country like the United States to ignore the fact that we've lost this war in the Middle East 40 times already, and we're gearing up to lose it again. It's because of all this narrow subjectivity that people have now adopted as the norm. As I always say in conclusion, people should be free to believe whatever it is that they want, but they have to pay the cost of those choices. And unfortunately, right now, it's kind of sort of almost ridiculous to say, since we're not going to be able to end a lot of these regulations and all of these rules that are in place. It's just not going to happen anytime soon. But that's what should happen. A lot of these regulations should be rolled back. Then, if we rolled back all of these regulations, all these rules, and all these superficial judgments on behavior, once we roll that back and people have freedom again, then we will see what is actually toxic or what is actually beneficial for society. And then more people will do what is beneficial because good ideas do not require force. That's it for today. I'll talk to you next time.